And we are very pleased today to introduce and present the report to you, Mr. Gary Lewis and Dr. Andreas Schloenhardt.
Thanks very much, Fan, and good morning, friends. And it is our great privilege to launch this report entitled Palermo on the Pacific Rim, Organized Crime Offences in the Asia-Pacific region this morning. I'd like to start by saying this. The word strategic is often used and misused to convey sometimes an inflated sense of the importance of a subject. However, I believe that the use of the phrase strategic threat is appropriate in describing and contextualizing the threat to civil society, to rule of law by organized criminal groups who are quite often operating at a transnational level. Chinese criminal organizations, and they're not unique, this view is held by most of what our former Secretary General called members of uncivil society. These organized criminal groups view the state of nature as one in which they must prevail, the one in which conventions and rules and norms of law are to be flouted in order to allow them primacy and to make money. Well, we may think that we have the advantage of rule of law to support the actions that we undertake, but there are many areas in which governments of the world and the international community are weak. The consequences of all of this yield an insidious network between armed conflict, terrorism, corruption, and organized crime that has had the potential to undermine effective governance. So what is the response that should come from governments, from civil society, and from members of the international community? We believe that there are really 4 clear responses. The first of these is for leadership at both the national and international level to acquire more of a sense of urgency in dealing with transnational organized crime. Secondly, the technical capacity for law enforcement, for the prosecutorial service, and for the judiciary to deal with organized and transnational organized crime must be strengthened. As are we trying to support elements of the third important dimension, which is the need for countries to see past borders, to see that crime control does not stay hemmed in within borders. The fourth area that we believe important in this effort is the need to know, the need to have accurate knowledge and information, and to share that information on the extent and nature and trend and pattern of what we're up against. Which brings me to the purpose of this morning's gathering, and that is to give visibility to a body of research that has been done by Andreas and his team. If I were to try to summarize those thoughts into a single phrase, I would, in all due modesty, suggest the following. It takes a network to defeat a network. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this morning, and thank you very much, Gary, for organizing the event and also for your very kind remarks in opening this morning. Luckily, there's no shortage of examples, and the one I want to start with is perhaps one that causes some smirks on people's faces. The gentleman in the photo here that you may recognize, his old mugshot, Al Capone is a famous mafioso, the leader of the Cosa Nostra in Chicago in the 1920s and 30s. The story about Al Capone is, of course, that law enforcement agencies were never able to get him for any of that. He structured his network so smartly that would completely isolate him from any criminal prosecution. The laws of the United States at the time were very well developed, but because he never physically engaged in any of these activities, it was impossible to attribute any of that to him. Some of you may know the little anecdote that the only thing he ever served time for was tax evasion for all the profits that he generated. Okay. Pablo Escobar Gaviria, the famous leader of the Colombian drug cartel, at the time in the early 90s, before he was killed in a shootout, was ranked by Forbes magazine as the 6th wealthiest person in the world. He accumulated several millions of dollars from the cocaine trade. Or a very current example that our Canadian colleagues are very familiar with, Niccolo Rizzuto, the known leader of the Cosa Nostra in Montreal, linked to the drug trade in large parts of North America. The RCMP, the Canadian Federal Police equivalent, has hundreds of hours of wiretapping on this guy. They know how he is linked to people in the organization, but they have nothing to prosecute him with. He went to court again last October, but as you can see from this headline, he walked free once more. The examples are ample. Okay. And the criminal law in any given country is a little bit obsessed with the idea that for us to arrest someone and prosecute someone and ultimately convict someone, we need an offense to be completed. Okay. Without a crime, there is no punishment. The idea behind this report, the idea behind the Palermo Convention, is to take this further, that we need to come up with new ideas to stretch the spectrum. And the offenses that we've looked at in the region do exactly that, expanding criminal liability in new and meaningful ways that will allow us to capture people that are more distantly related to the actual offenses that are carried out. That the people that sit perhaps somewhere in Medellin and Cali that oversee the drug trafficking that goes on every day, but never get their hands dirty, that we have a tool to hold them liable. There's a lot of muddying the water in that different types of association aren't differentiated. There's a difference between leading a criminal organization and selling them a sandwich. Some laws don't draw that difference, but that needs to be done, and I think the Canadian model is perhaps one that should seek wider consideration.
Of where the Asian countries are at.
In terms of signatories, everyone has, except for a number of Pacific islands, but in terms of East and Southeast Asian countries, everyone has signed the convention. Some of them have moved to implement them. Some also found themselves in a situation that they didn't need to amend their laws. UNODC has assisted countries like Vietnam in drafting legislation, which is still under consideration. The two countries where not a lot has happened are Laos, where there's no proposal whatsoever, and in Thailand as well. The convention was signed by the previous government under Thaksin Shinawatra, and he had a very comprehensive package before Parliament. Some of the procedural and law enforcement elements were implemented in Thailand, but the substantive criminal law doesn't currently have that. And to my knowledge, there are no proposals in Thai government circles at the moment to do something. Outside that, as I highlighted briefly, we have a bit of a mixture of approaches. Korea is perhaps the one that most authentically adopted the convention almost word for word.